I'd like to welcome you to tonight's meeting, which is Injustice and the British State. My name's Jill Chanter, I'm from Sheffield SWP, and tonight we've got a really impressive panel of speakers, and I'd like to thank them all for coming, and I'll introduce them as they speak. Each person will speak for approximately 10 minutes, and then we'll open the meeting up to discussion. At the moment, I think we'll just do it through a show of hands rather than speakers' slips. So at the end of the panel's introductions, we'll then open it up for questions and contributions. We do have some books here that are relevant to the subjects that the speakers are discussing tonight, and again, I'll refer to them as people get up to speak. And so I'm going to introduce, first of all, Gareth Peirce, who is a long-standing fighter and representative of people who have been victims of injustice from the British state over the years. So thank you, Gareth, very much for coming.
Can you hear me? Just about. Really close, I'm told, got to get. 10 minutes to talk about British state and injustice. Also, I have to apologise. Before the end of the meeting, I've got to go off to a wedding, and lest you think it's sheer frivolity, it's a man called Baba Ahmed, for whom some of you campaigned. He was brutalised by the Metropolitan Police, eventually fought for and awarded damages. Nevertheless, the Metropolitan Police shipped their evidence to the United States. He was extradited. He was held in the Supermax prison. But thank God he's back, and he's getting married today. I'll relay that to him. Thank you. It's very difficult to arrive at any comprehensible explanation as to why we are in meetings like this, month after month, year after year, when the manifestation of injustice has been so clear. So it's difficult when you can see the trajectory, when you can understand the history, and yet not rationalize why it's incapable of cessation. So we can understand that there is clear evidence, for instance, that the police in a militarized formation, orchestrated by the government of the day during the miners' strike, half killed 95 protesting miners, striking miners, prosecuted them on false evidence, and then case was abandoned. And we can see how some years later that same process was adopted by the South Yorkshire Police when out of control. The events at Hillsborough took place. And we can look back and we can think, had one been dealt with and stopped, could it have prevented the other? Or looking back further, when in Southall, the death of Blair Peach, they had first introduced the concept of horses riding into crowds. Would that have stopped Orgreave, and would that have stopped Hillsborough? Or looking back from Grenfell at the battles by the Black Power movement to strike out the actions of the racist police through the Mangrove trial, through the fight against the clearest possible racism, manifest by the same council, Kensington and Chelsea. So the police acting in conjunction with the wealthiest council, the wealthiest local authority in the country, used to go to All Saints Road and used to ask, why are people standing in the street? Why can they have not a life indoors like the rest of the gentrifying population of Kensington, Chelsea? Why are they here? Why are they here on the street? Those people bringing to this country, from the Windrush generation, life and soul, and dignity and enterprise, British values, reminding Britain of what it had lost. If you ever heard Darcus Howe, the late Darcus Howe, speak, he would talk. He was one of those who fought in the Mangrove trial, fought against the actions of the police, fought against the dehumanizing white supremacist gentrification that was leading to the attacks on the Mangrove. And he said, I came as a teenager. I had had a severe education in Trinidad, severe education into literature, culture, cricket. I had learned to revere everything, and I came to this country and found nobody else revered it. Forgotten, lost. He said, I was very surprised. I was actually more intelligent than many people I met. I was more cultured than many people I met. Now that history should have been in our DNA, should have meant that Grenfell, that a housing part of the population in a way that was negligent, beyond negligence, of safety and needs. How could that have happened? How could it have happened? It happened because of the construct we have, how we revere and use rights. It should have been in 1948 when the magnificent United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, hypocritical as it was, when at the same time the countries signing up for it were implementing apartheid, were implementing racist policies, were implementing economic degradation, were implementing slavery, exploitation. Nevertheless, it was magnificent. But the built-in vulnerability was that it was United Nations. The concept of the nation state was embedded in the process, and nation states were made responsible, not an international policing, international sanctions. Each nation was given, accorded, entrusted with responsibility for the human rights of those within its state. And so all those colonial attitudes, that there were two strands of society, or the world, there were two forms of nations, first class and second class. All those concepts remained constant, so that there is, to this day, concept of exceptionalism. And that's how it works. Exceptionalism for those who don't rate the same rights. Changes from time to time, society shifts from time to time, so if it's during the miners' strike, they're the enemy within. If they're Muslims today, then you have to look at the whole of Muslim society because it could be terrorists. The black community, are they policed in the same way, or is there a pre-crime form of suspicion that forms? Yes, of course, that's how we have accorded human rights manifestation in this country. Exceptionalism, where we choose to have exceptionalism or exceptional crimes, and if you're suspected of those, you aren't deserving of the same rights. And exceptionalism for those who act on behalf of the state. So a soldier or a policeman is not to be regarded in the same way if he or she kills or if he or she metes out brutality or injustice. And those two forms of exceptionalism have led to the way that injustice is perpetuated here. There is no equivalency for the victims of injustice to play a part in dismantling the structures of the state that have brought it about. You see the undercover police. They're not able to participate, to learn the data. You see, with Grenfell, there's an imbalance. These seeds of exceptionalism and the way that the layers of our past history and the way we thought are regrettably embedded in the way we deal with injustice now. And it's not a solution, but it's saying it's part of understanding why we're here month after month, year after year. Because campaign as we do, and occasionally succeed as we do, then it hasn't dealt with the underpinning of why things are so very wrong.
Thank you very much, Gareth. The next speaker is Sheila Coleman, who many of you will know has been an inspirational and incredibly resilient campaigner for the Hillsborough for Justice for Hillsborough campaign. So I'd like to thank Sheila for coming to speak.
Thank you. Is that all right? Can people hear me? Yeah, I never have a problem. Big mouth. Yeah, I'm not going to say much about Hillsborough tonight because I am effectively prevented from doing so because there are ongoing court cases, so I wouldn't wish to jeopardise at all, and there is an Attorney General ruling around what can be said and what can't be said. Nevertheless, I was not going to say much anyway because I think things move on, and for me the important thing is the connections we make around injustices and the common threads from either disasters, miscarriages of justice that on the surface appear to have little in common. I spoke the other night in Brighton on a platform with people, and just to list them, there was Hillsborough, Orgreave, Spy Cops, Shrewsbury campaign, blacklisted workers, and I would add to that the Grenfell disaster. And for me, the common thread through most of that was class and working class issues, because most of the people who have been victims within that group I've listed are in the main working class people who it is easier to get away with killing or with damaging or with setting up, and there's no two ways about that. It has been proved. So workers who for most of their good working years have been denied the right to work purely because someone has put their name on a list, because they were a union rep or they sought for better health and safety conditions in work. And to me, those things actually go to the heart of the society in which we live. And what it says to me is, as time has gone on, and people, know me, I've been involved around Hillsborough. Next year it will be 30 years. That was never my intention. It was never anyone's intention. But this is the sort of time that it takes if you seriously want to take on the state, if you want to challenge. And there are people who go way beyond that. Look at Bloody Sunday families and the events of Bloody Sunday. The Shrewsbury campaign, for example, as well, and Orgreave, which Gareth mentioned. And the common threads through it are that we look to one another for support. And, of course, the crucial factor there is that we are kept apart, we are kept separate, and we are told not to mix and not to liaise with one another. And that can take on various forms. And I will say one thing which is relevantly up to date. The Orgreave Truth and Justice campaign was able to be reactivated on the back of the 2012 Hillsborough Independent Panel report that said it was a conspiracy and a cover-up and involved South Yorkshire Police. On the back of that, and quite rightly so, Orgreave people could say, well, hang on a minute, we've got a stake in this, we've got an investment in this. And as a campaign, we are very keen to support and work with the Orgreave campaigners. I know for a fact that within a relatively short space of time, some of those campaigners were told not to speak to us, not to have anything to do with the Hillsborough Justice campaign, but rather, if they were to have dealings with anyone, make it the milder-mannered, more establishment Hillsborough Family Support Group. And there are those involved in the campaign who now will say, yet they were wrong for buying into that. But it was obvious to us. We had people down here who turned up to a demonstration supporting Orgreave people and were told, basically, go away. Now, that is because, not because they are bad people, but because they said, they were basically told in a roundabout way, you're damaging your campaign by being involved with these people. And that's just such a great example of how we are kept apart. Two things that I noticed today which bring things up to speed. One is I noticed a tweet today stating that the Daniel Morgan murder, which I suppose a lot of you will be familiar with and goes back a long way, a private investigator murdered. The Court of Appeal has today ruled that the Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police is liable for malicious prosecution and misfeasance in public office. And I have to say, that is, to me, was a really a testimony to Alistair Morgan, Daniel's brother, and other individuals involved in that campaign that goes back years and years, and involved taking on the senior police because they were right in it, up to the necks in it, in the death of Daniel Morgan. So that, to me, are those little things of hope that we always cling to, and it is so important to do that. The converse of that is, I also saw today that the Defence Secretary has backed an IRA amnesty if it ends the prosecution of those soldiers involved in the Troubles. So basically, that leads me to saying there is always a price we pay. And for me, the important thing is who defines what is justice, but also as well, who are the people consulted as to whether they agree with it or not? Because it's not always the case that those consulted are those on the receiving end. So if you look to Bloody Sunday, for example, and you're going back to 1972, so many of those families who lost people feel they have no stake in all this, that they are excluded. And I count some of them amongst my friends, and they are inspirational, and they have been inspiration and a source of inspiration for many years. They are considered awkward, they are considered obstructive, because they won't say, okay, we'll go along with this. Now, you might say in the bigger scheme of things, well, you should go along with it. But that is harder. It's easy to say when you haven't, your 15-year-old brother wasn't killed in the Troubles, or your father wasn't killed, when it's not someone directly involved with you. And I think that is the dilemma. When, in terms of our political selves, do we go with the bigger picture? And when do we say this is too high a price to pay and we cannot move forward till we get justice? Because what we have to look at, and Gareth touched on it around the two sets of rules. One for the ordinary individual when they do something, and one for the police and soldiers when they do something. Because we well know that soldiers went way beyond anything they were supposed to be doing over many years in Ireland. We know there was a shoot-to-kill policy. And equally, we know how police have operated over time with different communities throughout the country. And there is, I agree with Gareth, there is a two-tier system. It does change over time. You know, the community in which I live, in Liverpool 8, in the past, I have taught young black people, so intelligent, and so many of them are dead, incarcerated, sectioned under the Mental Health Act, or drug dealers or drug addicts. Those people had such an intelligence and were so inspirational. But was their intelligence and their experience of growing up in racist Liverpool harnessed for the good of the future of the city? No. They were criminalised. People doing law degrees were set up and criminalised so they could never go to the bar, so they could never be a solicitor because of their criminal records. And that cuts deep with me when I know these individuals and I know what has happened to them. And it has changed over the time. You know, I'm from the Irish community, and, you know, I'm not going to lecture you on the Irish community in this country. But in Liverpool, equally, I've been on the receiving end historically before the peace process of a lot of nasty things. And now it is the Muslim community. And put into all that mix, the Football Lads Alliance. I'm involved in Hillsborough. I'm telling you, the Football Lads Alliance has got nothing to do with football. And we've got to keep saying that. The language we use is so important in terms of how people get a foot in the door. We harnessed a grassroots element through football, and you can do it through football. But we have to harness people again and not let the right wing get in there. Every time they're coming out, we have to remind them it's not to do with football, and we have to remind them that we're having none of it. Because to me, there is this threat. It scares me for the you know, my advancing years. It really scares me, the society in which we are living, this shift to the right. And I really think that we have to get away from normalising these things, normalising racism, normalising food banks, normalising miscarriages of justice. So we have another tier. Well, the police do behave like that, so we'll put this tier in to deal with it when they are corrupt. No, remind these people that they are public servants. They are accountable and answerable to us. Let's not put in place a system where that acknowledges their faults and their fraud. Because when we do that, all we are doing is accepting a lower standard and a less civilized society. And I, for one, will not put up with that. And I do think, I hate I'm labouring it, I know, but the Football Lads Alliance need to kick, you know, they need to be kicked out, but we need to kick football out of their title. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Sheila. Our last panel speaker is Brian Richardson. He's a barrister. People may know that he's been a long-term anti-racist activist. He's a member of the SWP and has just co-authored an article in the International Socialist Journal that's available outside the room about youth crime, class and capitalism. So, Brian.
Thank you very much, Jill. Last and very much, at least, for reasons which I will explain. But let me begin with this phrase, sisters and brothers. No justice, just us. It's a phrase which I'm sure some of you are familiar with, and it's a phrase which I very much believe in. And that might surprise some of you when you know that I earn my living in the justice, or in the so-called justice system. So let me put my cards on the table. I think, as Sheila's just outlined, I think quite rightly, that working class people do not get justice in the system that we live under. Think about the area that I practice in, the criminal justice system. And I don't look at the clients that I deal with through rose-tinted spectacles. Very often, most of the time in fact, the people that I'm dealing with have done horrible things to other working class people. They've beaten them up, they've abused them, they've stolen from them, they may have sexually abused them. All sorts of horrible and oppressive things have happened. But they haven't done those things because they are inherently bad people, although our courts allow people's so-called bad character to be presented to courts as if people have a so-called propensity to act in that way, rather than acting in that way because of the pressures and the constraints that society places upon them. You think about what a huge amount of what happens in courts is about. It's to do with drugs. Something like 50% or more of stops and searches are to do with drugs. It's sheer hypocrisy when you think that we have a £5 billion plus drugs industry. There's been a debate recently, hasn't there, about the possible limited medicinal benefits of cannabis. But we all know that across the country, people from all backgrounds are taking drugs on a recreational basis, and yet we have completely hypocritical laws about it. But also contrast the way in which working class people are dragged through the courts and criminalised in the way that those young people that Sheila talked about are. Contrast that with Grenfell, for example, where, as we know, was it something like 30,000 tonnes, effectively, of what may as well have been petrol was wrapped around that building and led to the deaths of 72 people. And yet we don't even know. There should be no debate about whether homicide charges should be brought against the people responsible for that atrocity. And yet there's even a debate about whether or not using that kind of cladding should or should not be legal. It is an absolute disgrace. You think about other areas of law, people who are wanting to take their employers to court for abuse, sackings and so on. The fact that now, precisely because of cuts in the legal aid system, they're having to find money that they cannot afford. And if they cannot afford to pay the fees to start a case, then their chances of redress, their chances of turning back a sacking or whatever, are reduced virtually to nothing. Or think about the immigration and asylum system. Decisions made that people who are claiming asylum on the basis that they are fleeing persecution in the countries that they were born in or they lived in are deported and told that they should start their claim from asylum from the very place that they are trying to flee. Or think about the most recent example. Think about Grenfell. Think about people who lived most of their lives in this country, who worked, who paid into the system, who were reaching retirement age and are told they don't belong. They should go back to where supposedly they came from. That they have to pay £50,000 plus pounds in fees for healthcare simply because it was decided by the then Home Secretary, now the Prime Minister, that she wanted to create a hostile environment for illegal migrants. Laws, time and time again, that are set up against the interests of working class people and that oppress working class people. It is no coincidence that these things happen. They are not the consequence of overzealous officials or flawed implementation. They are the consequence of a society which is set up to serve the interests of the rich and powerful. Laws that are created by the rich and powerful to protect and preserve their privilege and power. So that's why I say that working class people, whatever area, families, employment, criminal justice, do not get justice in the system that we live under. Given that, if that is the case, then should we just give up and accept that nothing can be done? I think the answer to that has to be an emphatic no. And the reason why it has to be an emphatic no, I think, has been set out by the two people that I'm sharing the platform with. And let me say this. It is, for me, an incredible privilege to share this platform with Gareth Peirce and Sheila Coleman, because... Let me share something with you, actually. When I was coming in, I was talking to someone, and I said, I'm going to speak at this meeting. And she had a look and saw the three names, and she said to me, I apologise for embarrassing. She said, "Are you Gareth Peirce?" And my answer to that was, we obviously didn't know that Gareth is a woman. My answer to that was, I wish I was Gareth Peirce, because she is such an inspiration for all of us. Think about the phrase that the great anti-slavery campaigner Frederick Douglass said, that power grants nothing without a demand. We achieve nothing without struggle. And Gareth and Sheila have shown exactly how that can be done. One of the great privileges for me was being in the Court of Appeal on the day that Paul Hill and the Guildford Four were released, to see the joy that there was in the public gallery and the frustration amongst the judiciary and so on that they had to release them was an incredible day. You think about what Gareth talked about at the beginning of her presentation, the fact that she has to go to Babar Ahmad's wedding. And you think what Babar Ahmad had to go through, the oppression that he suffered at the hands of the British state. You could be completely crushed by the power of the state. He wasn't, and Gareth wasn't. And the fact that she has fought for decades, fighting the system, digging and digging and digging to unearth that little bit of evidence that shows that people are innocent, have been set up, have been fitted up, have been oppressed by the state, is an incredible example to us. But also think about the example that Sheila sets. I'm a football fan myself, and I remember watching with horror what happened at Hillsborough, and I remember reading with horror what was said in papers like The Sun about how people stole from the pockets of the people who were dying, how they urinated on the people who were dying, an absolute disgrace. And it was with dogged determination that people like Sheila and the Hillsborough Justice Campaign fought and have achieved a modicum of justice. But of course it's right to say that real justice has not been achieved. The people who died will never have their lives back. The Lawrence family, you think about the struggle that they fought. Stephen Lawrence will never have back the life that he could and should have led. But the example that these campaigns show is that we have to fight, and that when we fight, we can push back the state, we can expose the hypocrisy of the way the state operates. And the importance of that, I think, is that what we should remember in the last couple of minutes is how we achieve those things. I think we achieve those things through a combination of things. It requires journalists who are prepared to write those stories, who are prepared to expose those stories for a wide audience to read about. It requires those lawyers who are prepared to fight determinedly on behalf of their clients, but it also requires organisation on the ground from working class communities. I'm sure Sheila will say that what kept the Hillsborough Justice Campaign going was the support that they've received from working class communities. People may have heard Moira Samuels from the Justice for Grenfell campaign speak yesterday evening. She says that what's keeping their community going is the fact that round the country now there are silent marches every 14th of June in solidarity with the people of Grenfell. That's what gives them the strength and the determination to keep going. the Lawrence family said that in the darkest days, when they didn't know where to turn to keep their campaign going, it wasn't the Daily Mail and the front page headline about murderers after Stephen Lawrence's inquest. It was two things that kept their campaign going. This is what Doreen Lawrence says herself. One, it was when they met Nelson Mandela, newly released from prison in South Africa, and he gave an international flavour, an international appeal to their campaign. But it was also the support that they got on the ground from ordinary working class people, the people who went around their communities with buckets collecting, with petitions collecting, who took resolutions to their trade union branches, who took the argument to the Trades Union Congress and got the trade union movement to say that it would unconditionally underwrite the Stephen Lawrence family campaign. That is what working class solidarity means in action and in practice. And it is that solidarity of working class activity that will ensure that the justice campaigns that are around today can succeed tomorrow. But it is also that working class solidarity that we have to build upon to fight for a completely different and a far better society.
Thank you very much, Brian. Just before we start the discussion, I would like the opportunity to extend our appreciation to Gareth for making the time to come on a really busy evening. So thank you very much, Gareth. Okay, we've got about half an hour for discussion. The way that we'll run the discussion is if people would put their hands up, I'll take people to come up and speak at the microphone, please, because the meeting is being recorded. And I would ask people to only speak for 3 minutes. When it's got to 2 minutes, I'll tap on the mic, and when it's got to 3 minutes, I'll ask people to stop. So if people would like to indicate.
Two murders stick in my mind, and they bookend the system. The first one is the murder of John Charles de Menezes, and the second one is the murder of Yasser Yaqub. I think everyone knows about the murder of John Charles de Menezes, but for those who don't know, Yasser Yaqub was murdered by the police on a slip road off the M62 near Huddersfield. They went up there to kill him. It was a targeted assassination, and it was authorised from above, just like Bloody Sunday was. They offered no excuse, no explanation, and the murderers just melted away. And to my knowledge, there's been no offer of an explanation since. Now, I think if the police can do that, they can do anything. And the state cannot hold these murderers to account, because if they do, they'll refuse to murder people when it becomes really necessary. We've already had examples of armed officers threatening to hand the licences in if they're held to account. When Yasser Yaqub was murdered, it was an hard argument among my white friends, because a lot of them responded, well, he were a gangster. And that was overwhelmingly the response I got. But there's another side. I mean, I go to an old folks discussion group, and when I slated South Yorkshire Police for the continual failures, for a litany of failures, people said, what do you mean? It's all of them. It's not just South Yorkshire Police. Forgotten what I'm going to say. So why are those guilty for the deaths at Hillsborough on trial? Is it because they didn't actually murder the victims themselves with their own hands? Will there be repercussions for them? And will it mean that Grenfell, a proper response to Grenfell will happen sooner, or will they have to wait for 30 years? I think that we can force the pace, but it'll need to be, the response will need to be much bigger than it is. But while we're on the subject of football, what about the Bradford City fire? I mean, I recommend that people read about that, because as far as I know, nobody were held to account for that either. Thanks.
The speaker here will be followed by the man in the black jacket at the back.
Well, first I'd like to ask a question to both Sheila and Brian. Yes, I forgot your name, sorry. Has there ever been a policeman or policewoman ever been convicted of battering someone or killing someone in the UK? Is the first question that I'd ask you, because I honestly don't know the answer. I suspect it's probably a no, but if you guys know the answer, I'd be grateful if you could share that. But one of the things that Moira Samuels was in Dundee on Wednesday night. It was a very good meeting actually with the Trades Council. But one of my colleagues made a point that protests matter, justice campaigns matter. Both Sheila's campaign proves it to a T. So did the lady just left with the Guildford Four and everything. I mean, whenever people think that things like that don't actually matter, I think people just need to look at history. Protests and stuff like that do matter, and I would urge any time someone thinks there's a case where police should be arrested or police should be held accountable and they think that nothing can be changed, I think just some examples of the Guildford Four, the Birmingham Six, the Sheikh Obeyu trial, investigation is still going on. This was a man that was assaulted by at least 6 police officers. I mean, it was a black guy in Kirkcaldy back in 2015. Why on earth does it take 6 police officers to bring down one man? Is the first question I'd ask. It doesn't take that. We all know it's a racist state. And when I sometimes do get downhearted, when I see the injustice that goes on. But all I would say to people that are disheartened is keep fighting for it, because eventually these bastards will be brought to justice. And I just hope that people like that, I hope you guys can be the future generation, because those people deserve medals for what they've done.
Okay. The next speaker after this comrade will be the person in the front here.
Yeah, I want to talk about the fantastic victory of the Rotherham 12. I say that because I don't think I'll ever stop talking about the fantastic victory of the Rotherham 12, because it was such a great victory for the whole working class and for anti-racist, anti-fascist campaigners everywhere. And it's almost like when people say South Yorkshire Police, the next word is always Orgreave or Hillsborough or the Rotherham 12 or indeed the Rotherham child abuse scandal, because the police were to blame for that, for treating those young women the way they did, and they've got off the hook so far, but we're still coming for them. We're still campaigning in Rotherham to bring justice for the survivors, who are still campaigning in a very anti-racist, united way, which is a tremendous tribute to the way things have changed in Rotherham, where people have come together and fought back. The icing on the cake in the Rotherham 12 case was early this year, when it's a bit complicated, but there was 2 of the 12 defendants pleaded guilty on legal advice and changed their pleas, and their case was thrown out, totally acquitted, not guilty, because the police commander, people know the story, this is the police commander who knew nothing about fascists being in a pub, laying in wait for the Asian demonstrators who they attacked, and the whole thing led to the 12 being arrested for violent disorder. This same copper was unfit to give evidence. They threw the case out because he was going to unravel a load of other stuff, which can't really go into now, but, you know, this is how they behave when they're protecting their own rather than actually see the truth come out in court. To the extent where, after the first 10 were acquitted, I was outside a mosque one day and 2 coppers pulled up, wanted to know what I was doing, and it was for some anti-racist event. And then one of the 12, Abra Javid, came down just at that point, and this copper was telling us how the Rotherham 12 got off on a technicality. This is the lie that the police have perpetrated amongst their own ranks and elsewhere. So we said, oh, you mean the technicality of them being found innocent unanimously by a white working class jury? You mean that? He didn't know what to say, he couldn't say anything, but that's how the police are. They don't just wave a white flag and say, you won, we're going to go away. They keep coming back. We have to keep resisting. That's what the Hillsborough campaign, the Stephen Lawrence campaign, all the families' campaigns, they're a fantastic tribute to how we have to keep fighting. However long it takes, however long it takes, because the state default position when it comes to these cases is to cover up, and they do cover up, and they won't give us justice unless we keep fighting for it. And, is a marvellous tribute to working class people up and down this country, because it's that grassroots campaigning in the trade unions that have won the victory for the Rotherham 12, but also keep the fight going for so many other cases. And Grenfell ain't going to wait 27 years. They want justice now, and I think they should get it, and we should make sure they do. We should be out there fighting for them. And we have to start with stopping Trump and stopping Tommy Robinson next weekend, because the Rotherham 12 was the biggest victory, I think, in this country for anti-racism since Southall in 1979, I think it was, Bradford 12 in the early 80s. The same cases keep coming up when people fight back. They're right to fight back, and that's what the victory of the Rotherham 12 shows. If we fight, we can win.
Just before you start, the next speaker will be the comrade in the black shirt.
Yeah, I suppose I'm not the only one that really hopes that it's not going to take 19, 27, 29 or however many years for justice for Grenfell. And what I really got out of Gareth and Sheila's contributions was what Gareth said about the system that underpins all this injustice, that underpins all these cover-ups, continues. That's why the injustices continue. That's why the cover-ups continue. Sheila said it comes down to class. It's one rule for them, one rule for us. It's one rule for the forces that they use against us. They have armed forces against us, and they have impunity. We don't have impunity under this system. The system that is underpinning carries on. And, again, a tribute to the tenacity that it takes within that loaded system. It's totally loaded against us, and we have these incredible fighters with this tenacity, the willingness to become experts in things they never wanted to become experts in. Maura was talking last night about having to learn about cladding and building materials. She never wanted to have to do that. She's got to do that to fight. You've got to learn the tricks. You've got to learn how they think. You've got to, it's like an education in oppression and in exploitation that people have to do who are continuing these fights. And wasn't it wonderful to hear that Baba Ahmed, something good is happening in his life, something simple and ordinary like a wedding, and we're cheering because he's got the right to live his life. I just wanted to go on and say really that the things that I've learned when I've been in the SWP is one of the things that happened when I first joined was that the French public sector workers went on strike. One of the things they did was they opened up all the metro so that all the homeless people could go and live in there and have shelter during the winter. In the Russian Revolution, they set free the prisoners who were unjustly treated. They were all set free overnight. They were set free. In the Egyptian Revolution, they went and unlocked all the secret files of the Secret Service, all the evidence that had been gathered against working class people, and they got rid of it. They tore it up, and they let people out of prison. And I suppose what I'm saying is, I don't want it to be abstract, but we need an uprising where people can be set free, where people who are unjustly in prison are set free overnight. And what I want to pay tribute to Gareth and Sheila and people like and Brian and people like them, because when that happens, we will know who we want to imprison. We will know who we want to punish. We will know who we want to bring to justice when we've turned the world right upside down.
I want to make two quick points. The first point is a shift that's taken place about British justice, and that is that when you used to be arrested back in the old days and you were told you're going to go in front of a jury, you used to shudder because you knew if you went in front of a jury in the 1960s and 1970s, the likelihood you're automatically going to go to jail. Now, there's another shift that's taken place that a lot of people know that the police are lying bastards. That's a very important change that's taken place amongst working class people. When I went round with Winston Silcott back in the days in 1985, you could go to the Yorkshire miners because they knew what had happened, but you couldn't go everywhere. People didn't automatically listen to you. When you go around with Rush and Charles' family, now people give money and listen and say that happened and that's an injustice. That's a shift that's taken place amongst working class people. The second thing to do is to look at the nature of the state. You see, Tommy Robinson should be in jail forever. If you had been involved in domestic violence, criminal fraud, or whatever it is, the question is, why is he not in jail all the time, right? Because the guy's a criminal, drug dealer, whatever. No, I've got nothing against, but that's what he is, right? The real question is, when he marches on the street and they come along with thugs, guess what happens when the police come there? Suddenly, there's none of them there. Well, I've been on demonstrations. I was arrested 37 times. I think one of my lawyers has said got sick of me, right? But you got arrested 37 times. You just used to pop up in a demo, you're under arrest, right? Now, when you look at it, they come out onto the streets, and guess what happens? Suddenly, there's not enough police. Suddenly, there's people with these little blue things saying, well, people are... In fact, they beat the police up. Did you see the film where they're beating up the police? Imagine if that was us. We'd chase the Metropolitan Police off the street. I tell you what would have happened. The front page of The Sun would be, find these thugs. They put our pictures up like they did in the poll tax, and they put our pictures up like they did during the riots. That didn't happen. Why? Because justice isn't blind. If you're a racist thug, you march on the streets and you get away with it. It's important that we mobilise on the 14th, but that double standard of the law, the way that it operates and stuff like that, that does matter. But it also does matter that people fight back. If I didn't have a decent lawyer, I'd be in prison. That's the truth. The lawyer came along. I remember somebody swept into the room. He floated in, this copper, and he goes, you're going away for a very long time. But I got calls from other people, Sheila, various other people, filled in forms, supported people, and you don't go to jail. The truth of it is, if you have solidarity from the working class people, you don't go to jail. But more importantly, and this is my absolute final point, if we're going to change this, it is a naturally unjust system that's built and organised. The Birmingham 6, Paddy Hill, once told me, if you look at the Old Bailey, he goes, it looks out to the west, because it looks over to the rich. And he goes, but look where the backside is faced. It faces to the east, where the working class people live, because that's the basis of justice. They filth on us and look to the rich in order to protect it. And it's got these little scales where it's weighed in their favour. The only way you can change that is by fundamentally changing the way our societies are and pulling those statues down, because they're statues of injustice.
After the next speaker will be the comrade in the blue shirt.
Well, I just wanted to say one thing that really, really gets me going, especially in York, is the injustice of the people on the streets, homeless people. There was a man who we spoke to on a paper sale, and he said that his mum had got Alzheimer's, so she wasn't able to sign her flat over to him, and he became homeless. And as he was telling this story, a policeman walked past, told him to jog on, looked up at me and smiled. I thought, you ain't smiling at me, policeman. Like, I'm old enough to know you're not protecting me, you are protecting the state. That poor man has done nothing. The state has put him on the street, and then the state punishes him for being on the street. This system that we currently live under, it crushes and it squeezes people, and it gets everything it can out of them, and then it punishes those people when they try and get over what the state has done to them. It pushes people and pushes people so that they're in their little boxes and they don't fight back, and that is why it's so important that we don't let them divide us and we stand together in solidarity and we fight back and we don't let them oppress us. And yeah, finally, sorry, I get myself in a state. The police say they're protecting us. They're not protecting us. They're protecting the system, and the system does not protect us. So I think it's so important that we stand in solidarity and we protect the people who deserve protecting, which is the oppressed, and not the people that the police are protecting, which is the state.
Tomorrow, London Pride is taking place in London, and when the Pride marches first started to happen and people went to march in the 1970s, they were shouted at and called all sorts of things by the police along the side of the demonstration. In the demonstration, on the Pride demonstration tomorrow, and actually leading after an argument, trade unionists began to join the Pride demonstrations and lead the Pride demonstrations, and that was a very important that was a very important victory, a collaboration between an oppressed group and the trade unions, but continuing to face a very hostile police force. The Pride demonstration tomorrow, the trade unions will be pushed right to the back of the demonstration. It will feature commercial organisations marching at the front. I can't remember whether or not the red arrows are actually flying overhead this year, but they did last year. The police will be on the demonstration. They will be there in their uniforms, pink-washing themselves. Look at how changed we are. Look at how nice and cuddly we are. It will be an exercise in actually trying to put on the friendly face of the state. But nobody should be under any illusion about what the actual nature of the state is. Marxists understand the reason why we have a state. Why do we have a state? The police, the army, these armed bodies of men, people who are mostly men. Why do we have it? We have it because our society is divided into fundamentally irreconcilable classes. Marx said that 150 years ago. Fundamental irreconcilable classes. And when you've got one class, a minority class, trying to rule over a majority class in which it has fundamentally irreconcilable aims, you need not just to rule by the force of ideology, you also need to rule by force. You need the stop and searches, you need the arrests, you need the army that will go and fight on your behalf and that will go into the miners' strike when things get desperate. And therefore the state is there as an instrument that is not neutral. There is this myth, isn't there, that the state is neutral. The state is there as an instrument that is not neutral but is designed to maintain the rule of one class over another. And therefore the people who fight now are doing a fantastic job, and it does mean that people's opinions of the state are starting to change and shift, and people are seeing through it. What we need, though, actually, is a radical uprooting of that society, because they do it deliberately, don't they? I thought the comment about keeping the Hillsborough and the Orgreave Justice people apart was fantastic, because that is what they're scared of. They are scared of the power of our side. They are scared of us coming together, and the role of the state is precisely to keep us apart. And therefore, alongside backing the campaigns, fighting to change people's ideas, fighting for justice, exposing the nature of the state, we also need to be about rebuilding from below the power of our class to fight. Because I tell you what, where you get so many people now will sign petitions, put money in buckets, go on demonstrations. When we start to really move in big numbers, if during Orgreave, actually if after Orgreave, the power stations, the print workers, if we'd have shut them all down, that would have never have happened. We need to fight both over the campaigns, but also to rebuild the power of our class, get over this idea that the state is neutral, that we can't unite, and fight to radically change society.
Okay. Good evening. Just a point of interest which you will have to think about possibly. In 1963, my wife came to Birmingham, and she found, when she was looking for accommodation, no blacks, no dogs, no Irish. And she said to her friends, the people she'd worked with, why do they do that? Well, I'm not Irish, I'm not black, I'm white, I'm English. What's it got to do with me? The whole point of that story is that we cannot build these campaigns successfully unless we involve thousands and thousands of people. So every time you meet somebody who said, but I'm not interested in that, or that's nothing to do with me, you must have the argument. That is what we do as a party, and that's how we build for all the campaigns. When I went to Sheffield in '62, the police in Sheffield were known as the Boot Squad. I soon found out why they were. Nothing has changed. We constantly have to be vigilant. But I would go back to my first statement. It concerns you all. You have to argue and explain to everybody why the struggle against the police, against the state, is important. That way we grow. Thank you.
Okay. The problem with injustice is inbuilt into the criminal justice system. So we have, one of the main problems we have today is non-disclosure of evidence. The police not providing evidence, as I'm a criminal defence lawyer, to the defence so that people are left without the evidence, and that's come up recently. And we've got a DPP who thinks there's no one in prison for lack of non-disclosure. She is the only person in the country who thinks that, and she's in charge of the prosecution. That's one of the major problems we have. Second major problem is if you want to appeal and you're innocent in prison, the CCRC, which is a dreadful body, referred less than 1% of the cases that were sent to it last year. Third problem, if you get through that system and you win an appeal, there's a new law that basically means you have to prove you're innocent, which means you cannot get compensation. So I represent a young man called Sam Hallam, who came out of prison in 2012, and he can't get compensation, and we're challenging that at the moment in the Supreme Court. So what do you do in a dreadful system where it's just creating miscarriages of justice and it's getting worse? Well, what we've done is we've started working with an all-party parliamentary group on miscarriages of justice, which had its first sort of public meeting just a couple of weeks ago. And 100 people came together, of families from miscarriages of justice, and they heard a client of mine, Eddie Guilfoyle, make his first public speech and gave him a standing ovation. And in the pub afterwards, conversations, discussions about what can we do, that it's gone too far. Liam Allen, the recent rape case, the guy who almost went to prison when there was a whole phone load of evidence that proved he was innocent, is fired up. People at Jengba that are there, the Joint Enterprise Campaign, campaigns and individuals coming together to discuss what we can do. A tweet goes out today, we need a march. People are starting to talk about that, a march in November. It'll be the first time that's happened, I'm told, by the person I spoke to since the 90s. These things haven't gone away, and I just come back on something that Brian said about the press. It is true, there are the odd good journalists, a media gentleman on the Windrush issue, and Dan Conn on the Hillsborough. But generally, the press have become, there aren't the journalists who cover miscarriages of justice anymore. Bob Woffenden died, stuff my sort of dad used to cover, it doesn't exist anymore. You can't get these stories into the press. And the only place that really covered the Rotherham 12 thing and did it very, very well consistently was Socialist Worker. Now that's not a good, that's both impressive but also a very, very bad thing. We have to fight locally, it seems to me, to look out for these campaigns, because everywhere locally there will be a case. If there isn't one now, there will be one soon, of a miscarriage case, of a family who are left on their own. There is a very long, strong socialist tradition where we have supported the Birmingham 6, the Guildford 4, the Tottenham 3, all these big cases through history. And we need to look out for these cases, and we need to look out for any protests that we can support and give these people support, because with that, as Sheila says, people coming together is what they hate. It's with that we can win for these families.
So thank you for the discussion, and I'll pass over to Sheila to come back.
Thank you. In relation to the question you asked, Brian will be better to answer it than me. I can't see you now, but the person who asked the question around, has a policeman or police officer ever been convicted of murder? I think I'm right in saying that in respect of deaths of custody, even where people have fought and got people to court, no officer has ever been convicted of murder. I stand to be corrected on that, and I know that Brian's the person who will do that, and he can probably give more information in relation to that. Comments around the Rotherham 12, yes, I remember going over to Sheffield and speaking on a platform supporting the Rotherham 12, and it was a great victory. But again, these things only happen when people come together, and there is basically people from all various campaigns and just supporters of a better life who will come and support those most in need. I think what's really important is that we acknowledge that these things that have been spoken about tonight and some of the cases that have been spoken about, what it points to so obviously is political policing. These things happen because of how we are policed. You know, the idea of the police as public servants accountable to us is a fine one in theory, but in practice it just doesn't happen. And when we look at the spy cops, there's probably no greater example of that, of political policing, than the spy cops. And the idea that this was just some rogue police officers a little bit too enthusiastic and vigilant in trying to do the job is absolutely ludicrous. And I find it of some concern that the inquiry, which I think I'm right in saying is 3 years in the making now, has virtually released no evidence whatsoever, is redacting names and holding names of those officers. And I think stands as one of the worst organised cases of abuse alongside so many others. So that's another reason why we all have to come together. I am heartened, it's sad to say, but the Grenfell disaster, I just give you an example. I don't think these people will wait 30 years, nor should they. And that gives me hope that people do learn from the experiences of others. I remember on television a news report of Grenfell families and residents basically being very vocal at a council meeting, and it was on the news, and one of the bereaved Hillsborough families that I know said how great it was to see that and how they wish they'd been like that and not done as they were told in being dignified. And that's a real word that I remember from the very early days of Hillsborough. Oh no, don't do that. They'll think we don't know how to behave. You've got to be dignified. Well, dignity gets you nowhere. It's not dignified when you are killing people, when the state is killing people. And I say to the people of Grenfell, they do have that support. It's not easy. People will be co-opted, bought off. Any disaster on a grand scale there will be divisions created. It's sad, but it's actually true. But the people of Grenfell are buoyed up, I do believe, and are vibrant because it goes to the heart of how we are treated as working class people in this country. So I personally think that Grenfell, the enormity of it is such that the state will have to try and cover it up because it goes to the heart of the housing crisis in the country. It goes to the heart of big business and corruption. So there will be attempts to cover it up, but I do think it's on a scale, and there is that experience and knowledge around where people will push and push. And as Weyman and others have said, will forensically keep on doggedly looking for evidence to prove what really happened and why it happened. And I think it was Nicola that said about the expertise has learned over years. And yes, I know families that became so au fait with House of Lords rulings, etc., and would want nothing more than to discuss them with you. These were people who, in the large, working class people carrying out working class jobs, but they had to wise up. They had to get an education. It's not the best way, it's not the way you'd recommend, but they got an education through adversity, which saw them in good stead. And, I would add to that, people like, and he's being mentioned here tonight, Paddy Hill and Jerry Conlon learned the hard way what they were up against and tried then to use that experience for the good of others. So I suppose really I've enjoyed the meeting and the contributions from the floor tonight, and for me what it says is yes, there are these injustices and sometimes we are just chipping away at the wall, but if we didn't do that, then the Guildford Four, those and the Birmingham 6, those still alive, would still be languishing in prison today. We have to remember those things. And when in our darkest times, we have to look at those people. You know, Brian said, you know, Hillsborough families have had a modicum of justice. Yes, there is now an unlawful killing verdict, and, you know, it is a modicum, but in another sense, it's huge compared to where Hillsborough families were at over time. So bottom line is we can't give up, but we do have to find common ground in all the different cases and campaigns that are ongoing, because it is only by standing together that we will really make big changes. Thank you.
You may have seen me, I raised a very good question, you may have seen me scrambling to try and find my bag, because I was looking for my phone to try and Google whether a police officer had ever been convicted of murder, because I certainly don't know of any example. I couldn't find any examples on my phone, but Sheila is absolutely right to say that in relation to deaths in custody, certainly since the likes of Inquest have collated these things and looked back over the last 50 years, no police officer has been found culpable in relation to the hundreds of deaths that have occurred over the last 50 years or so. So I think that probably answers that particular question, and it tells us, of course, something about the society that we live in. I think there is a public policy attitude towards this, which is that it would be too much of a danger to the state. It would, potentially opening the floodgates in terms of the way that police harass and bully people on the streets. It would open the floodgates, and therefore it cannot be allowed to happen. Therefore, they are determined to protect their own, precisely as I think it was Sue said, because of the role that the police play in our society. The fundamental role of the police isn't and never has been to solve crime. The Metropolitan Police was set up in 1829 in order to, at a time, of course, when you had the Chartists, when you had mass working class mobilisation, the Metropolitan Police was set up to preserve and protect law and order. That was what they were set up for. That is fundamentally what the role of the police is and always has been. And therefore, we have to fight and challenge through our own collective organisation these kinds of injustices. Let me say something about Grenfell, because one of the other things that it has been a privilege for me to do is to spend quite a bit of time over the last year working with Justice for Grenfell and the community, and going regularly to the silent marches and talking to people over there. And yes, it is a long, hard slog. And Moira Samuels talked very eloquently last night about how people are battle-weary. Yes, they are battle-weary, but they are also emboldened by the support and solidarity they receive. And I think it's important to say that in just a year, they have achieved an incredible amount. The simple fact that they decided that an inquiry had to be launched in the first place was because people didn't just shut up and grieve, but they were angry and said that they want justice, have demanded justice. The fact that they were forced to concede that there would be not enough, nowhere near enough, but there needed to be at least 2 representatives of the local community on the diverse panel. Nowhere near enough, but was a concession that they had to make because people were determined and dogged. The fact was, the first 2 weeks of the inquiry, when it officially opened, was spent hearing testimonies from the families and friends of the people who died. And again, I sat through some, and people said, why are we having this? Why is this happening? It's not part of the evidence. Arguably, it's a waste of time just hearing stuff which doesn't directly talk about the what happened in terms of the fire. To sit through those testimonies was an incredible privilege. I'm used to being in court and hearing, well-paid, fancy lawyers making long speeches, probably a bit like the one I'm making here now. Yeah. Very, very, trained and eloquent people. None of them could have spoken anything like as well as the families and friends of the people who died. Why? Because they were speaking with passion, with love, with pride, but also also with anger about what happened to their loved ones. It was an incredible experience to sit and to hear those testimonies. But what those things also did, and I think it led to some of probably the programmes that you have seen and heard on the TV and radio, on Channel 4, on BBC, articles in The Guardian, and so on, is recognition that the people who died in Grenfell Tower were not, grasping scroungers, bogus refugees and so on. They were some of the most, that was a building brimming full of the most brilliant people who made a real contribution to this society. Teachers, architects, engineers, people who get up and clean our factories, who keep London on the move. Really incredibly talented people. And that's what those testimonies did. The fact that we had those 2 weeks of testimonies, again, was because the people who are fighting for justice for Grenfell are fighting for real recognition of who their loved ones were, the contribution that they made to this society. That didn't come about through nothing. That came about because people have fought and because people have been determined. The opening of the inquiry, people have said, you have to address questions of institutional racism, the institutional racism that those people face, and also the marginalisation and exclusion of the wider united working class that live in North Kensington. That has come about because of the unity of that community and the solidarity that they've achieved. Now, of course, that is nowhere near justice has been achieved yet. And there is a major battle for interpretation about what went on. For me, it is an absolute disgrace that there is an attempt to blame the firefighters, to say that somehow the firefighters who, as Moira said, went into that burning building, risked their lives to try and save people, that somehow they are to blame for sticking by a stay-put policy. It is a disgrace that they are being targeted and attacked rather than the people who put that cladding on in the first place. In the face, of course, of what, and again, it shows you something about the knowledge and intelligence that ordinary working class people have. For years, people in the local community said and complained about the way that they were treated, complained about the cladding, complained about the refurbishment and so on, and were ignored and considered to be troublemakers. In the same way that the people Sheila's talked about, spy cops and so on. Again, the inquiry, into it is political policing. Policing units that were set up in 1968 precisely because of things like the anti-Vietnam War campaigns and marches to spy upon people who were setting up campaigns, environmental campaigns, animal rights campaigns, anti-racist campaigns and so on. The Lawrence family subjected to surveillance. Janet Alder, who you will hear from tomorrow, whose brother, Christopher Alder, served this country, served in the army, suffered the indignity of death at the hands of Humberside police. Instead of investigating properly the circumstances in which Christopher died, instead we had Janet Alder spied upon by the police. An absolute disgrace and a measure of the extent to which the state is prepared to go to keep our side down and to oppress our side. But we have to, quite rightly, believe that we can challenge these things. As I say, I think the Justice for Grenfell campaign has already achieved a great deal in just a year. I haven't got justice. That is a long way off. But they have the reason why they have achieved what they have achieved so far, I think, is because not only have they had the solidarity from people like Sheila and the Hillsborough Justice Campaign, but they have learned from the likes of the Hillsborough Justice Campaign how you organise, how you campaign, how you keep your community together, how you reach out and demand and achieve solidarity. And those are the lessons that we have to learn. And there is a fight and there is a struggle, a fight and a struggle for the better society. And it is an urgent one. People have talked, Sheila talked about, and I apologise for, I'm not going to apologise for finishing on this. The demonstrations next week are fantastically important. They're so important because we know that there are some people who, rather than building solidarity amongst working class communities, seek to sow division, seek to divide our side, seek to impose an alternative, rotten, racist solution. And it's one that we have to say, we're not going to allow that. Never again are we going to allow those kind of horrors to be visited upon our side and our class. And it is therefore through learning the kinds of lessons of the justice campaigns that we have had the privilege of hearing from this evening. It's about learning the lessons of how we build solidarity in our side that are so important. And it's quite right that we have to build those and support those justice campaigns, but we need also to go further and to struggle and build the support, the solidarity and the confidence of our class that can fight for and achieve a far better society.